Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you're still warm enough and your feet are not too cold, and very soon we'll be warming up again. Fold is empty. Okay. So I think we're going to talk about something a little bit different. This paper is, there are three authors. Dr. Luci is the head of the Center for Cybersecurity, Center for Cyberspace Studies at Nasarawa State University in Kefi, which is just a little bit outside Abuja, the capital, and his student, Pene Zion. We have actually published this paper. It's about to appear this week in the African Journal of Information and Communication. We published the initial work to design a cybersecurity resilience measurement framework, resilience maturity measurement framework. This particular presentation takes things just one step further, but as you're going to see, we require many steps in order to create a resilient maturity measurement framework. So can I move it along? So just a little bit of perspective. We're in a context, we live in an era of digital transformation in economic sectors, in government, in society more generally, and we've heard a little bit about that. In fact, it's hard to not know that you're living in an era of digital transformation. Where we are seeing the shift towards smart cities and villages and industries and tech hubs and even regulatory technologies. And the intention is that this work will ultimately lead us to some form of regulatory technology. Now, when I say regulatory technology, we don't only mean that this is technology for regulators. It can also be regulatory technology that is used for self-regulation. Something we all know very well, but it's good to remind ourselves of the context in which we are measuring resilience, in that cybersecurity is a moving target. We have no sooner, or perhaps not even managed to cope with the demands of existing technologies or historical technologies such as particular forms of networks, and we then already find ourselves in an environment where we're having to confront completely new network technologies, completely new software environments, completely new information processing environments. We haven't even begun to look at the situation where we have automated robotic processing, as we do in the banking and finance sector, for example. So there are just a myriad of possible loopholes. And as we advance through these stages and levels and phases of maturity of digital transformation, we find more and more loopholes. But rather than focus on the many emerging technologies, perhaps what we need to think about is that we're moving into an era which has been called or referred to as Industry 4.0 or Society 4.0, which has absolutely nothing to do with the Fourth Industrial Revolution. It's more a case of the maturation of digital technologies themselves. And so we just use this kind of a framework for the design principles that are shaping Industry 4.0 and Society 4.0, which are interconnection, information transparency, decentralized decisions, and technical assistance. So interconnection being Internet of Things, Internet of Everything, and this is just a kind of we're just opening up all the vaults of data and money everywhere, and the vulnerabilities are increasing. Information transparency, if we want to solve problems, then we need information to be available. So on the one hand, this is a good thing, and we want to create all kinds of new innovations, like with information transparency, you might talk about digital twins. So you have a lot of data available about a particular problem, so that you can model that problem in the cyber world, solve that problem, and then come back with the knowledge that you've created and solve that problem in the real world. But what that means is that you're exposing lots of data. And of course, with decentralized decisions and technical assistance, which is a lot about robotics, then this is where other threats come into play. So we're thinking about threats not simply in terms of the particular sector or the particular process, but also in a kind of a futuristic way, if you like. I'm not going to stay with this slide very long. I'm simply reflecting that these design principles have specific realities, Internet of Everything or digital twin or robotics, and each of those is supported by a particular technology. So our perspective of cyber resilience has to extend from, you know, the very big picture to the very small technology picture. So the research problem that we considered was the absence of tools available for the more precise measurement of cybersecurity resilience maturity. Because what we find is that mostly we have international conventions, we have legislation, and we have regulation, and we also have cybersecurity frameworks, but these tend very much to be guidelines rather than precise measurements. So we argue that there's currently no tool to measure in a quantitative way the maturity state of enterprise-level cybersecurity resilience. So just a quick note on, you know, where are we on the African continent in terms of this kind of problem. 13 African countries have some form of cybercrime legislation, while 21 have substantive provisions only partially in place. This might mean that this is really old legislation with some reference to information security or some attempt to set up some form of regulation or intervention, but it isn't really, you know, best principles or best practice. 7 African countries have laws or draft laws broadly in line with the Budapest Convention on cybercrime, but that's a 2001 convention, so again, you know, not particularly current. The African Union Convention is quite general, and it kind of encourages e-commerce, but doesn't really get down to anything near cybersecurity resilience. And 16 African countries have established CSIRTs or CERTs. So this is a really small number of countries that are even dealing with the phenomena of cybersecurity at a sort of a high level, at a national level or a policy level or a legislative level, let alone, you know, the number of countries really dealing with it at a completely granular level. So what we really want to focus on here is not the policy, the legislation, but on the organizational level resilience. Just to say that even these, you know, big global frameworks that are used in just about every country in the world, the COVID-5 from ISACA and the NIST CSF cybersecurity framework, really set out some kind of mapping. And I'm sorry I didn't put that map slide up because it's so, you know, it's so granular, but it's really important to say that in our design we have used COVID-5, the NIST CSF framework, and some other frameworks to create the broad framing. But then what we're really trying to do is to go in and look at the very granular detail, which I will show in a moment. We had a couple of design questions. If you want to design a quantitative resilience measurement framework, you would have to ask at least the following questions. What is the current state of the organization in terms of resilience maturity? What is the next stage of maturity with this organization? Then going to the next stage, what are the factors, causes, or defects responsible for the initial stage where the organization is positioned? Then how does the organization need to improve in order to achieve the next stage of maturity? what are the necessary security controls required for improvement, and how does the organization create momentum to get to that point. But in this presentation, I'm only going to talk about a few things. I'm going to talk about the smallest unit of measure, which is the resilience maturity measure. I'm going to talk about the relationship of the functions, including categories and subcategories of the functions to each other, use one example, very small example of the identify function, and then just show you the set of 10 mathematical equations and the cybersecurity resilience quadrant, which is how you position an organization. You can position an organization through this measurement process in one of 4 quadrants. Okay. So this is the big picture, the high level of the framework. We've used the COVID-5, the CIS security controls, the SOGP for information systems, and the ISO standards, and we've mapped that onto the NIST cybersecurity framework, which is probably the most widely used framework in terms of general guidance. And there are 5 broad functions, namely identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And what we've done then is to start the process of building, this is by no means finished, start the process of building this cybersecurity resilience maturity measurement model, and the outcome is the quadrant. So just in between these 2 slides, what I haven't got here is the mapping of the CIS controls to the NIST framework. And that gives you I think close to 100 categories of functions functions and function categories and function subcategories that we are going to be working on in order to create this instrument. But using one example, we can use the example of the resilience function, identify, so that's one of the 5 functions. Then we specifically use the function category of asset management. There are other function categories. We specifically use the resilience function subcategory of inventory, and then the resilience measures relate to devices and systems or software and applications. And if you then sum up the summation of all your subcategory, your function subcategories, the measures, you then get a resilience measurement impact factor. I'm going to demonstrate that in a moment. I think it's quite hard to follow if we don't demonstrate. But so we might have more than devices and systems and software and applications. We'll have a whole list of resilience measures, and if we sum all of those, we get a resilience measure impact factor. So I'm not going to go through this. It is in the paper. We do define these, functions and categories and subcategories and measures and impact factors for you in the paper, just to be clear. So then one can assign a weighting factor to the smallest unit of measure, which is the RM, definition 6, resilience measure. This is the smallest unit. It measures a precise control, like the one we showed you, devices and systems, and one can then ask specific questions about devices and systems, and you can assign a weighting factor. There's an indication of on what basis, what would be the criteria that you would assign that weighting factor, 0 or 1 or 2 or 4 or 6, depending on what level of control is in place. And so with all of that, putting all of that together, you can then begin to create your instrument where you ask certain questions about the resilience measure and you assign a weighting factor. So we've done that by way of example. I'll just use one, maybe the first one. How frequently does your organization monitor unauthorized devices and systems connected to your internet connected to your network infrastructure. If you have automatic identification, then that is the the highest level. Baseline security is in place and it is consistent with best practice application, then we give that a weighting factor of 6. If you only monitor it every week, we give you a 4, every month a 2, every 3 months a 1, and never 0. So you can begin to create, you know, this kind of measurement, RM measuring instruments. So let's assume that we have now done that for all the identify, all the protect, all the respond, all the recover factors. How do we then move forward? So each of these are risk contributing function factors. Identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. They each contribute to where the organization will be positioned on the cybersecurity resilience quadrant. Okay. We have to give them a weighting. Do we say they're all worth 20% of the whole? We argued that they're not each worth 20% of the whole. There are 5 factors, so we'd start off at 20%, but we argued that the protect factor is more important than any of the other 4 factors. And we also argued that the recover factor is less important, marginally, but less important than the other 4 factors, because if you wanted to ensure or promote resilience, you would have to put more effort, more investment, more time, more skills into protect and recover. Recover is very important, but you don't want to have the problem in the first place. So you want to reduce the opportunity for that problem to occur. Okay, so cutting everything very, very short, this takes us to a set of 10 equations. And the equations are in the paper. I'm going to talk you through them very quickly, not the detail of the maths. But this is a set of summations. Each of the equations is a set of summations. So we'll start with the resilience measurement impact factor, because we want to aggregate the effect of all the smaller resilience measures for a particular function. And so that gives us equation 1. But we then want to normalize the result for that function subcategory, so we fiddled a bit with the equation, and we're going to divide that by the number of resilience effects under consideration. So that was at the subcategory level. The next 2 equations look at the category level. Time, 2 minutes, 1 minute, 2 minutes, 1 minute. And then we move from there to the function factor level. So all we're doing is creating 3 sets of equations, 1 to deal with the subcategory level, 1 to deal with the category level, 1 to deal with the function factor level. That then takes us to the next level of summation, which is the cyber security resilience function index, where we now apply the weighting that we spoke about earlier. In other words, the 20, 25, 20, 20, 15%. Okay? And that takes us to the equation 9. So we now have a cybersecurity resilience function index, which where we have included all the 5 functions: identify, protect, defend, respond, recover, and we have weighted them according to those percentages, and that then leads us to the optimized cybersecurity resilience function index, which is the set of quadrants. So equation 10 leads us to a set of 4 quadrants, which is this. Quadrant 1 is defined between 0 and 0.25, defined up to 0.5, managed up to 0.75, and optimized up to 0.1. And this is the final slide, and the cybersecurity resilience quadrant, and what we, having done those quite extensive measurements for each function factor, the computational outcome will lead the organization to be positioned in one of these quadrants. It's a kind of an upside down Z, if you like. I'm just going to come over here. So you could be in quadrant 1, or quadrant 2, or quadrant 3, or quadrant 4. And obviously, if you're in quadrant 1, you want to move to quadrant 2, to quadrant 3, and find the quadrant 4. But what this does is to ensure that the organization understands much more specifically where it actually is, as opposed to saying, well, I followed this CIS controls, and I've done this, and I've introduced that, but actually I don't know where I am. Thank you very much.